Welcome back to Klepper's Corner, Today in History. Today, May 9th, is one of those dates where history walks in carrying a crown, a cipher machine, a broken bridge, a stolen orb stuffed down someone's pants, and somehow says, "Relax, I can explain." And that is the magic of this particular day. It is not one story, it is a whole drawer full of human ambition, panic, invention, bad maps, and people discovering that power is temporary, paperwork is dangerous, and if a man dressed as a clergyman asked to see the crown jewels, maybe check his pockets. Segment 1, and myths, bishops, and other dangerous certainties. We begin in the ancient world, where May 9th was assigned by later scholars as the date of the fall of Troy in 1185 BC, which is a wonderfully confident thing to do with an event that includes gods, curses, prophetic horses, and approximately 9,000 years of poetic exaggeration. Eratosthenes and other ancient chronologists tried to pin the whole thing to a calendar like a detective putting a thumbtack through a thunderstorm, counting backward from the first recorded Olympiad to make mythology behave like a spreadsheet. And honestly, that is very human. We love taking chaos and saying, no, this happened on a Tuesday. The destruction of Troy became more than a city falling. It became the original Western trauma franchise, inspiring Homer, Greek identity, Roman origin stories, and every later empire that wanted to say, "We are descended from survivors, not opportunists with better branding." Then, centuries later, on May 9th, 328, Athanasius became Patriarch of Alexandria, stepping into a theological fight so intense it makes modern comment sections look like a church bake sale. The argument over whether Christ was created or co-eternal was not some quiet seminar dispute. It dragged bishops, emperors, mobs, exiles, and imperial troops into the machinery of belief. Athanasius was young, probably too young by church rules, and immediately became that one person in every meeting who says, "Actually, words matter," and then proves it for 45 years. He was exiled 5 times, which is either persecution or the ancient world's most aggressive performance review. Together, Troy and Athanasius remind us that civilizations are built not only by armies and walls, but by stories people refuse to surrender. Sometimes those stories are sung by poets. Sometimes they are defended by angry little bishops in the desert. Either way, history begins when memory becomes stubborn. Segment 2, and medieval alliances, bad deals, and buildings that outlive everybody. In the medieval section of May 9th, history gets very interested in the fine art of making choices that technically solve one problem while creating 12 larger, sharper ones. In 1009, the Lombard nobleman Malus led a revolt in Bari against Byzantine rule, fed up with taxes, cultural domination, and the general experience of being governed from far away by people who probably pronounced your name wrong while billing you. To fight the Byzantines, Malus invited Norman mercenaries into southern Italy, which is a little like hiring raccoons to protect your pantry. Yes, they may scare off the original intruder, but now the raccoons own the house and are forming a duchy. Those Normans eventually helped erase Byzantine power in the region and reshape the entire Mediterranean. Then, on May 9th, 1092, Lincoln Cathedral was consecrated, a massive Norman statement piece built to dominate the English landscape and remind the conquered Anglo-Saxons that heaven apparently had a very strong building permit department. Bishop Remigius de Facamp spent years pushing this monument toward completion and then died 2 days before the consecration, which feels less like irony and more like history forgetting to let the man attend his own ribbon cutting. Fires and earthquakes later battered the structure, yet it endured, eventually becoming one of the architectural wonders of Europe. And in 1386, England and Portugal signed the Treaty of Windsor, creating the oldest diplomatic alliance still in force today. That one is almost suspiciously successful. Most medieval agreements lasted until somebody's cousin got insulted at dinner. But this one survived monarchies, empires, wars, and centuries of European leaders saying, surely this parchment still counts. It did. Medieval May 9th teaches us that power can come from rebellion, stone, or paperwork. The trick is knowing whether you are building a cathedral, founding an alliance, or accidentally inviting the next landlords. Segment 3, and explorers, thieves, and the fine line between destiny and delusion. By the early modern period, May 9th becomes a parade of people absolutely convinced they are the main character, which is usually when history starts hiding the breakable objects. In 1502, Christopher Columbus left Cadiz on his fourth and final voyage, older, sicker, angrier, and still committed to the idea that he had found Asia, if everyone would simply stop pointing out the giant continents in the way. He was trying to find a passage to the Indian Ocean and restore his reputation after previously being arrested and sent back to Spain in chains for his brutal misrule of Hispaniola. Nothing says, "Give me another chance," like being legally told not to return to the colony you founded. He mapped parts of Central America, failed to find the route, lost ships to worms, and spent a miserable year marooned in Jamaica, watching his age of personal discovery turn into Spain's age of organized conquest. Then, in 1540, Hernando de Alarcón sailed into the Gulf of California, trying to resupply Coronado's expedition in its search for the mythical Seven Cities of Cibola. The two Spanish missions missed each other in the vast Southwest, which is basically the 16th century version of having full bars and still not getting the text. Alarcón buried letters by the Colorado River, marked them with a cross, and sailed away. Coronado's starving men found them later. Proof that sometimes history does not need villains, just bad timing and unrealistic gold rumors. And then comes Thomas Blood in 1671, who disguised himself as a clergyman and tried to steal the crown jewels from the Tower of London. He flattened St. Edward's crown and stuffed the sovereign's orb into his pants, because apparently treason has storage limitations. Captured and brought before King Charles II, Blood was so entertaining that the king pardoned him and gave him a pension. That is not justice. That is monarchy discovering influencer culture early. These stories are about men chasing glory, gold, and symbols, and finding out that destiny often ends with shipworms, missed deliveries, or royal jewelry wedged somewhere deeply undignified. Segment 4, and empires, endings, and myths sold with a ticket stub. The 19th century on May 9th offers us three very different endings. The end of a wooden naval era, the end of Confederate resistance in the West, and the theatrical export of the American frontier after the actual frontier was already dying. In 1864, during the Second Schleswig War, Danish wooden sailing ships fought Austrian and Prussian forces near Heligoland and scored a rare tactical victory at sea. The Austrian flagship Schwarzenberg was set ablaze, and the Allied fleet retreated into neutral British waters. It was brave, dramatic, and strategically useless, which is often how history rewards excellent effort during a collapsing situation. Denmark won the naval fight while losing the war on land, proving again that you can have the better day and still lose the century. 1 year later, on May 9, 1865, Nathan Bedford Forrest surrendered his Confederate forces at Gainesville, Alabama, just as President Andrew Johnson moved to end the Confederacy's remaining belligerent rights abroad. Forrest's surrender helped close organized Confederate military resistance in the Western Theater. But the dark irony is that Forrest, a former slave trader tied to the Fort Pillow massacre, would soon redirect his talents into racial terror as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. So yes, the war ended, but hatred did not exactly pack a suitcase and move out. It just changed uniforms. Then, in 1887, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show opened in London, turning the American frontier into an international spectacle with cowboys, sharpshooters, staged raids, and enough mythology to make empire look like entertainment. Queen Victoria herself attended and reportedly bowed her head to the American flag, which must have been an incredible moment. The British Empire respectfully acknowledging the former colony's new national export, which was apparently horses, gunsmoke, and heavily edited trauma. Together, these events show how eras end unevenly. A fleet becomes obsolete. A rebellion surrenders. A violent frontier gets repackaged as family entertainment with better lighting. Segment 5, and dictators, code machines, and the terrifying power of bad assumptions. The 20th century on May 9th is where the stakes get enormous, and the margin for error gets terrifyingly small. In 1926, Commander Richard Byrd claimed he had flown over the North Pole with Floyd Bennett, and the world celebrated him as a heroic conqueror of the frozen unknown. The Navy and National Geographic verified the claim. Parades followed, medals came out, and American exploration got itself a gleaming new legend. The problem is that later evidence, including Byrd's own smudged diary, suggests the flight probably never reached the pole at all. The plane appears to have turned back early, which means the great triumph may have been less first over the North Pole and more first to weaponize ambiguous navigation math for public relations. In 1936, the stakes darkened as fascist Italy annexed Ethiopia after a brutal campaign that used poison gas and exposed the League of Nations as a strongly worded suggestion with stationery. Emperor Haile Selassie warned the world that it is us today, it will be you tomorrow. And history, because it has no shame, immediately began proving him right. Then, in 1941, British forces captured the German submarine U-110 and recovered an Enigma machine and code books, giving Bletchley Park an intelligence breakthrough that helped turn the Battle of the Atlantic. It is one of those moments where the fate of millions pivots on a boarding party climbing into a damaged submarine with revolvers and nerves of steel. The Germans did not realize the secret had been compromised, and that ignorance became one of the Allies' most powerful weapons. These events are linked by assumption. Byrd assumed fame could outrun evidence. Mussolini assumed brutality would go unanswered, and the German Navy assumed its codes were safe. History's favorite hobby is waiting quietly until someone says, "There's no way this can go wrong." Segment 6, and post-war promises, public failures, and machines with googly eyes. After World War II, May 9th keeps asking whether humanity can learn from disaster. And the answer is a cautious occasionally, but usually after a truly unacceptable amount of evidence. In 1945, the Soviet Union celebrated Victory Day after the German surrender reached Moscow past midnight, creating a holiday rooted in staggering sacrifice, grief, pride, and survival. Before the missile parades and state choreography, the first celebrations were people in the streets sharing food, vodka, tears, and the stunned realization that annihilation had been avoided at a price almost too vast to comprehend. In 1946, King Victor Emmanuel III abdicated in Italy, trying to save the monarchy from its association with Mussolini and fascism by handing the crown to his son, Umberto II. It failed so quickly that Umberto became the May King, reigning for just 34 days, which is less a monarchy than a free trial. Then, in 1950, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed pooling French and West German coal and steel under a shared authority, turning the raw materials of war into the foundations of European integration. It was peace built not on hugs, but on supply chains, which may be the most European sentence ever spoken. In 1960, the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive, reshaping women's lives, education, careers, and family planning with a pill small enough to fit in a purse and powerful enough to terrify half of society's gatekeepers. In 1974, formal impeachment hearings against President Richard Nixon began, showing Americans the presidency could be investigated like any other office, even if the office had been secretly taping itself like a paranoid podcast host. Then, darker lessons followed. The 1980 Sunshine Skyway Bridge collapse killed 35 people and changed bridge safety design. NATO's 1999 bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade showed that precision weapons still depend on human maps. The 2001 Accra Stadium disaster showed how bad crowd control can turn fear into mass death. And then, in 2014, Mr. Trash Wheel debuted in Baltimore Harbor, proving that sometimes civic progress arrives not as a speech, not as a treaty, but as a solar-powered garbage-eating machine with giant googly eyes. After all that history, maybe the lesson is simple. Humanity fails spectacularly, reforms slowly, and occasionally saves itself by making the cleanup equipment adorable. In conclusion, May 9th is a date packed with fallen cities, stubborn bishops, medieval alliances, doomed explorers, fake triumphs, real disasters, collapsing monarchies, constitutional stress tests, and one very charming aquatic trash gobbler. It reminds us that history is not a straight line toward wisdom. It is more like a committee meeting held during a thunderstorm, where half the people are building cathedrals, one guy is stealing the crown jewels, a king is trying to abdicate his way out of consequences, and somewhere in Baltimore, a machine with googly eyes is doing more visible public service than several empires combined. The past does not repeat perfectly, but it does rhyme, mumble, misfile the paperwork, and occasionally bomb the wrong building because somebody trusted an old map. And that may be the real lesson of today. Power fades, myths survive, institutions matter, and whenever possible, check your sources before launching the plane, invading the country, or stuffing the sovereign's orb into your pants.